President Obama's upcoming visit to Estonia is the best bit of news that the Baltic states have received during the course of the last several years, I would argue. Earlier this year, there were real questions in Estonia, in Latvia, and in Lithuania over whether or not the United States remained committed to NATO and to defending them under Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. I, as an American, a former official, and the head of a think tank in Estonia, besides being a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, found it hard to swallow those sorts of doubts, knowing in my heart of hearts how sacrosanct Article 5 is. But in reality, there were these deep concerns. And of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, its escalation of that conflict, has only added to those concerns. So President Obama's visit comes just when the Baltic states needed reassurance more than ever from their most important ally. All three of them, whose leaders will be meeting with President Obama in Tallinn, require repeated and continuous visible reassurance that NATO is going to be there. I have to argue that the United States has done a pretty good job through its leadership in NATO and President Obama's own statements in recent months and his own meetings, in fact, with the Baltic presidents in Stockholm and then back in Washington, in providing such reassurance. But against the backdrop of the Russia reset policy, the U.S., if you want to call it, pivot or rebalancing toward Asia, and then now clear distraction of the U.S. elsewhere in Iraq and in Syria, not to mention in Iran, this visit now will provide that reassurance that the Baltic states really need. To add a little more color, I think what's happened in Ukraine could spill over into the NATO space in the Baltic region, let's say in eastern Latvia, if, for example, the same sort of tactics were used by President Putin there as he used in Crimea and is using now in eastern Ukraine, whereby a group of soldiers without any markings show up. Russia denies that they're Russian soldiers. They occupy some fields, maybe a few towns, let's say in eastern Latvia or Estonia. And a couple weeks later, as President Putin did during his annual press conference, announces, oh, those are our troops. NATO will then be confronted with a terrible decision over either going to war with Russia or Article 5 collapsing and NATO with it falling apart. So the best thing to do now is to provide visible reassurance to our allies and to show President Putin that Article 5 is as strong, as firm, and as sacrosanct as ever. That's the core of what President Obama's visit will do. Thank you. Crucial that President Obama makes a couple of points very clear during his visit to Tallinn. Number one is that he will fight and hopefully lead at NATO's summit in Wales for collective defense and a refocusing on the homeland of NATO as the alliance's primary goal in primary operation. During the course of the past decade, it's understandable that NATO has shifted out of area, so to speak. It's spent so much time and done so much great work in Afghanistan. With that coming to an end, and with this significant threat to the security of Europe itself, not posed by the military adventurism of President Putin in Ukraine, it's essential that NATO's top leader, President Obama, make clear that Europe and the North Atlantic community, as outlined by Article 3 of the North Atlantic Treaty, the area north of the Tropic of Capricorn, is NATO's primary focus. Number two, I think it's also crucial that President Obama make clear that the United States wants to pull NATO toward permanent basing of NATO troops in Eastern Europe and in the so-called new NATO member states, including the Baltic states and Poland. That President Obama disagrees with Chancellor Merkel's stance, which is that there should be no new bases for NATO in Eastern Europe, and that nothing should be done that will hurt Russia, as she said recently. And I think it's very important that President Obama make a strong case for the pre-positioning of NATO materiel and equipment in Eastern Europe, in new member states. There's a lot of talk now about creating such a facility in Szczecin, Poland, which is just about as far west as you can get in Eastern Europe, so it shouldn't be as worrisome as some people might think, vis-a-vis Russia. And finally, President Obama needs to make absolutely clear that the U.S. commitment to Article 5 and to the Baltic states remains as firm as it ever has been, and is a continuation and a reflection of the longstanding U.S. policy of never recognizing the incorporation of the Baltic states into the Soviet Union. The U.S., in other words, needs to make clear it is wedded to the independence of our NATO allies in Eastern Europe and the Baltic states, as much as it ever has been, as much as it has been to any member of NATO since the beginning of the alliance.